All right, so my name is Matthew David, and my topic was a glance at historical Chinese and Japanese war films. So for this, I picked Red Cliff, the movie. Uh, Summary: it takes place during the Han Dynasty. Southern Chinese warlords Liu Bu and Sun Quan, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, unite under the leadership of Zhao Yu to fend off an oppressive force led by the northern warlord Cao Cao. The movie, I think, was released in China in 2008, later released in the US 2009. It grossed 250 million and shattered the Asian box office. I think we learned that Titanic at the time was the highest grossing movie in Asia at the time before this movie came out. And the movie I decided to compare it to is one I did in one of our discussion boards, which is The Last Samurai. The movie takes place in the late 1870s. Japan at the time is kind of just got discovered, is in the process of industrialization. So Japan's kind of torn between modernizing and staying a very traditional um, country. So a rebel faction is born of samurai, which is led by Katsumoto, who intend to preserve the traditions of feudal Japan and the samurai. The story follows American captain Nathan, who goes over there. At first, he goes over to train the Japanese military to fight against the samurai, but he ends up getting captured and assimilates into the samurai culture, and he's still like I guess he's just like amazed by them, so he decides to stay and help. This was released in 2003, so this was released before Red Cliff, and it grossed around 456 million at the box office. So why these two movies? Looking at historical fighting, I thought Red Cliff was a really good movie to look at because they exaggerated a lot of things, and it just kind of shows you how the film industry kind of looks at this piece of history and how they view like the strategy and the leaders and the warlords themselves. So, and both movies kind of like showed a very large force fighting a very small force. Um, which is one reason that it interested me so much is because like an underdog story. And both of them were kind of based off true events. Red Cliff was based off the Battle of Red Cliff, which I think happened a lot earlier than what happened in The Last Samurai. But The Last Samurai is based off of a war, the Boshin War, which happened like late 1870s. Um, and it's actually kind of based off of a book that was written, which is based off of the war. So the American you see in the movie is actually in real life was a Frenchman. Um, he traveled to Japan prior to the war, like in the movie, to train the soldiers. Ended up liking the samurai and ended up fighting with the samurai. So why I looking at these movies? I'm looking at the movies to see how the film industry depicts like the historical Asian battles and the generals and tactics involved in these battles. So some similarities I saw in the movies was, yeah, they were both greatly outnumbered. In Red Cliff, it's like over 800,000 men to a very small force. And they were both on the defensive. It's like kind of like they're strategically planning how they were going to defend, their people. In the beginning of Red Cliff, you see them trying to protect refugees, and in The Last Samurai, they're protecting the last samurai village. Excuse me. They both use cover and concealment. So in Red Cliff, you see them make a dust cloud so that when the cavalry comes through, they can't really see where they're going. And in The Last Samurai, they use a similar tactic. They do it with fire and smoke. So they let the soldiers come in and they pop the smoke behind them so they can kind of isolate a smaller number of units. So it's kind of similar. Um, this kind of takes away the enemy advantage. So it takes away the charge from the cavalry because it was 2,000 cavalry and they didn't have as many cavalry. So it was taking away the charge advantage. If they couldn't see, they kind of box them in. And in The Last Samurai, they're going against guns and Gatling guns. So they kind of took away the range from the gunners. It's very not ethical strategy. It's not like, oh, straightforward. It's more of a very like kind of guerrilla warfare, what they did to try to the best they could do to win. Similars in leadership, you see a lot of acts of bravery. In the Red Cliff, you see these generals like take on armies by themselves. They tell people to run, like they stay behind to fight. You see them like depicted as very brave, honorable men who are willing to like sacrifice their lives for the greater good. The side that was fighting the southern generals. And you see an unwillingness to surrender. Obviously, in like the Last Samurai, they're fighting against people with guns, and there's very few of them. It's like a whole country versus a very small faction. But they really wanted to hone in that point of that the samurai tradition was very important to the Japanese culture. Strategic prowess, you see like them overcome these great numbers. They make up all these great strategies. In the Red Cliff, you see them like planning, like what's Cao gonna do? Like, is this a diversion? You see like kind of like them playing, playing chess, not checkers. Generals are seen as very respected, highly respected people. Everybody is like very highly respected individuals. In The Last Samurai, even though he's the bad guy, all the enemy generals, they all respect him very highly because he's very highly renowned around Japan. Both generals, like the main generals in both movies, they really kind of hone in on the importance of the culture of China and Japan. In terms of music, you see some scenes where Zhao Yu's like, let's play some music, let's like get into our culture, and you see this similar things in The Last Samurai where they do plays, or they like worship around the cherry blossom tree. And they both hone in the importance of teamwork. They're not going to beat these great forces by themselves, so it's kind of about like coming together and teamwork. So the differences I saw in Tactus is you see a lot more use of high ground in the Red Cliff, where the boats are coming in and trying to storm the gates, and they're shooting down at them. More formations are used in the Chinese film, like uh, the wing formation, and then the turtle formation you see when they're fighting the cavalry. You also see a lot of shield walls in the Chinese film, and they use the shield walls, and then they try to spear through the shield wall. Cavalry charge. There's cavalry charge in both movies, but in terms of fighting the outnumbered, you see the Last Samurai use cavalry charge for their advantage, and in the Chinese film they like try to target like defend against a cavalry charge. Concealment's super huge in The Last Samurai. You see a scene where they're fighting in the woods, and they're like hiding behind trees, shooting bows and arrows. So they use concealment a lot in that movie. Um, a huge difference also like who they were fighting. In the Chinese movie, it's like they're fighting this crazy large number of people, but they all have about the same equipment. But in The Last Samurai, it's guns versus swords and spears and bows. Difference in leadership. I saw like a lot of exaggerated feats in the Chinese movie. They put a lot of emphasis on like how strong these generals were, like, their reflexes. Whereas in The Last Samurai, the generals are pictured as very normal people, people that just like have fun, chill out, but just like love their families. You see them very malleable. These scenes where they're like getting shot up, and it's like you see that they die. And whereas in like the Chinese film, most of the generals on the southern side just like kind of go beast mode and kind of fight off a lot of units. In numbers, yes. In the Chinese movie, it like has more emphasis on multiple generals, and as a Japanese movie, it's kind of just like one general, and follows the American like following that general. In terms of screen time, the generals get a lot more screen time in the Red Cliff. I feel it's like they're both action movies, but it's more action packed of just like seeing the generals like fight and how they like carry themselves. Whereas in The Last Samurai, it's more about the like samurai culture. They like focus on the cultural aspect more rather than like the fighting aspect, and just kind of homing that exaggerated feat, emphasis on the leader's capabilities in the Chinese film, and yeah, culture versus individual leadership feats. So my overall finds, I find the movies depict a very similar theme of like honor, integrity, and leadership. However, Red Cliffs put a huge emphasis on how strong their leaders actually are in terms of combat. Whereas The Last Samurai shows like I said, more how malleable and weak humans alone can be, and it's just kind of about the samurai culture is what makes them strong and like keeps them like honed. Uh, in the Red Cliff, it kind of teaches that through precision and smart tactics, like no army is unbeatable. You could outsmart anything. Whereas in the Japanese film, they don't really win. They kind of like they lose, but it's about like showing their samurai tradition, their culture. Like they're gonna stick by their culture, and even as they lose, it kind of touches the audience and affects how the enemies see them. It gives them more respect. So different perceptions, like I see in the film industry, is like both Chinese and Japanese cultures through the film, like put an emphasis on strong leadership, fighters, warlords, and the shogunate. However, the comparison is the capabilities of these leaders to seem almost godlike in the Chinese film. Like they like super strength, they're like pushing like people super far, like they kind of flying all over the place. It's kind of more exaggerated. Whereas the Japanese films, they're not like completely exempt from exaggerating the abilities of samurai, but it's not as notable and like as extreme as the Chinese film. So in conclusion, the tactics and leadership depicted by the film industry show how cunning the Chinese and Japanese warriors were. It puts a massive emphasis on the Chinese generals themselves, whereas the Japanese movie was more emphasis on the culture of the samurai and like the way of life, how they carry themselves. Um, and we could see how much, like through these movies, how much military played a role in their culture back in the day. With the shogunate being like a super massive thing and all the warlords fighting over steak. Um, to the point where in China, these in the movies they were depicted as like having superhuman capabilities. So my questions for the rest of the class is why do you think the warlords and generals were viewed the way they were back then, and how do you think Redcliffe portrays the role of women in ancient Chinese culture? You see Zhao Yu's wife, like how do you think she was portrayed, and do you think the weapons and martial arts depicted in the film, the Redcliffe, are accurate for the time period? So that is it. Thank you for this. How do I end my stream now? There should be a